Yeah,
It's
that
just,
article got a lot of mileage.
well, that was what I thought. Whoa, how the media picks up on certain things is
Yeah, there
just
was a similar thing with in the New York Times recently. I was gonna write a rebuttal too, but I haven't got. There's so many other things I need to do before I get to that. But that one was, yeah, that one was definitely in need of a rebuttal, and it popped up on my radar left and right, and so I'm like, okay, the universe is throwing it out there as a whisper, and I feel called to respond, and so yeah, no, the there are several things wrong with their premise from the get-go, but we can talk about it in a minute.
yeah, we can talk about it now if you want. I'm happy to dive in because I'm really curious. As soon as I started seeing that it was gaining so much traction in the media, I
Yeah, how did
immediately
you find
thought
out about
about
it?
you. And I thought, Cannabis has all this plethora of research, right? And they're just looking at the randomized controlled trials, which is great, but it doesn't really give you the full picture of what this plant can do. And I was struck by the fact that it really seemed like they were only looking at the isolates, right? Like the cannabidiol, or the THC itself, without having the whole plant aspect of it.
That is the to me that is the key primary uh, counterpoint criticism. You don't go to a pharmacy to look for a pain pill, and you look at that section that has like 100 different pain pills on the shelf, and just because they're all pills, you assume that they're all the same, or that the research behind them is all the same. And it wouldn't occur to anybody to do that, but that's exactly what they did. And what they do most of the time, they look at cannabis as a one size fits all, and it's one of the key counterpoints that it makes it really easy to criticize these types of studies
Yeah, 100%.
because, as you well know, each chemotype has uniquely different effects, especially on patient populations challenged with their mental health issues.
Oh,
And
yeah.
much of it is biphasic effects and dose-dependent effects that are completely different from one to the other. And
And
so,
terpene profiles. I
and
mean, nowhere in there do
I
they
don't
talk
get
about
me
pro.
started on terpenes, right? Same with acid forms or, CBG. It's not even mentioned,
Yeah.
and anyway. So
Yeah, well,
yeah,
let's
that
take
is
a minute to welcome Debbie and Dawn Marie. Hello, ladies. We,
hey ladies.
Hello.
Uva and I just started, we dove right in because this is such a juicy discussion. We couldn't help ourselves. Um,
I love to hear y'all discuss it because this is something that I think we are all triggered by, to be honest, is these kind of studies.
well, and what Uva brought up right away was like the mileage that it got in the media, right? I mean, there's these studies that are coming out all the time. We know that because of Cannabis, but yet this one particular study just took off in the media so widely. How does that happen? Um, how does that happen?
Headlines. Headlines. They do this nice juicy headline, gets everybody's attention, and you really need to read the whole study in order to see what the study says. It's been very frustrating because that's not the only one. There's lots of them coming out now. They're
Eh,
totally the opposite of what we expect. But
No, there was just another um, link sent to me about a study published in the New York Times, and their conclusion was pretty similar to the one reached by this study that's focusing on mental health. And I haven't read the study yet, but I guarantee you that the 9 counterpoints I wrote about for this study, probably most of them will apply to that one as well. But again, I think the key counterpoint that's really easy to make is they look at all cannabis study like it's that cannabis is or cannabinoid-based therapeutic is one thing, one pill that is supposed to help with all these mental health disorders from anxiety to PTSD to psychosis to depression. And we don't do that with omega 3s. We don't say omega 3s don't work for mental health diseases because they're not providing a cure. But we do that when it comes to cannabis, and we know there's nuance in this. Omega 3s can make a significant difference in a number of the symptoms experienced by these types of patient populations, as well as many other chronic patient populations, because it's a modulator of the endocannabinoid dome, partly because of that. But there's a lot of research pointing to the benefit of supplementing with omega 3s, but nobody says it's not useful because it doesn't cure anxiety or PTSD, which is what they did or what they often do with cannabis. And so one of the other inroads to provide some constructive criticism is that people in the research community, if they are on this side of that fine line between having an open mind and being informed by the narrative on the war on drugs, are not really looking to learn more. They are looking to confirm what they believe. And so that bias shows up in their research questions, in their research structure. What do you think?
Oh, I totally agree with you on that. And I think one of the things that sticks out to me in all of these research studies is that, and we wrote an article about it just recently, we don't define what use is. So when we talk about cannabis use, is it you consume cannabis orally, smoke it topically, and then how many times? Are you consuming it 15 times a day or are you consuming it twice? So the comparisons between these studies don't even work out because we can't even define what a cannabis user is as far as use. And,
Very well.
we don't do that with pharmaceuticals.
Another really good point to add to the foundation of constructive criticism to this particular type of study. Absolutely.
It's frustrating that we can't even define that because we would never head into a study with any pharmaceutical under those terms.
I mean, in a way, what I like about the study is that it raises all these questions and it raises the ire of people who know better. And, we have emotional responses to this, and we are clearly more open to learn more rather than to reaffirm what's been part of the consensus than much of the research community on that side of that line. And so, it's just that big money is many times I suspect behind it because there is money to be made. I mean, who's losing money? I would look at that in terms of follow the money and who's got a vested interest in cannabis not being used and studied in these specific patient populations. And we know alcohol consumption is going down where cannabis is legalized. We know that there are numerous case studies across all mental health patient populations where self-medication with cannabis is providing a great relief. And we also know that there is, real harm that's being done by the inappropriate use of cannabis. So raising the necessity for education and complex education and open-minded education and qualitative-based education even more so into the forefront.
Well, I think what sets us apart from whoever's on the other side of that fence is we actually want to understand how this plant works, how it engages with our system, and how can it help. Let's be real, cannabis doesn't cure anything. We can't make that claim, nor do pharmaceuticals. They maintain control, help keep it in harmony. And so if we start looking at it from that perspective, then we can start learning about how does this plant work within a certain demographic. The other difference is everybody's ECS is different. And so what works for one person with the exact same anxiety, depression, PTSD, whatever it may be, isn't going to work because of a whole nother barrier of factors that they have in their life and in their system.
I totally agree. I mean, the way I look at it is from an evolutionary perspective. The endocannabinoid system is roughly 600 million years old. So small organisms, when evolution started, even before there were animals, already had a functional endocannabinoid system. Cannabis didn't show up until like what, 30 million years ago from an evolutionary point of view. So there's a huge gap between all life having a shared ancient biology that's called the endocannabinoid system, critical to homeostasis, critical to well-being, critical to having resilience, critical to healing. And cannabis doesn't show up until recently. Now, having said that, cannabis, or various aspects of cannabis, various components of cannabis, speak the language of the endocannabinoid system with near accuracy. And so utilizing various cannabis constituents in an educated fashion, just like a translator would choose its words very carefully to express themselves, is where we need to go as far as clinicians or as far as educated patients is concerned, is to utilize the cannabis constituents in the right translation, for the lack of a better metaphor, for each individual patient. Here is this patient's endocannabinoid system. What cannabis constituents get us the deepest inroads towards their optimized state, and in the safest possible way? So, the endocannabinoid system is a regulatory system, not an organ system. It's a regulatory system present in all tissues, in all organs, in all organ systems. And so when we're looking at chronic diseases, a handful of the common denominators that show up with most chronic diseases have to do with the dysfunctional endocannabinoid system. And so it turns out that several cannabis constituents can modulate, when used appropriately, these common underlying pathologies shared by most chronic diseases. What? Chronic pain, chronic inflammation, chronic oxidative stress, chronic dysphoria, and chronic destruction or reduction in quality of life. Now, various cannabis constituents have shown to help with all of those. So these constituents are the right words speaking to that person's endocannabinoid system in such a way as to become a soothing balm to help them regulate at a system level. And that regulation is not showing up in any of these studies. They're looking at a cure for anxiety and depression rather than an upgrade in regulatory status of the endocannabinoid system, expressing itself through better sleep, improved quality of life, reduction in oxidative stress, anti-inflammatory, less pain, to name just the big ones. So, having said that, very few studies look at regulatory at a regulatory umbrella, and the endocannabinoid system is a regulatory system. And so it's a new frontier. You know, it's like regulatory medicine. Research is ongoing and it's interesting, and they include endocannabinoid research, but it, you know, like I said, it's a new frontier, and we're we're fertilizing this research in the ways that we do.
Yeah, I have like a three-pronged comment question. Number one, I find it very disturbing researchers that are making these claims, and they seem to be still focused on THC as being the culprit, number one, with mental health in particular. My second observation is in my practice with taking care of patients. I've taken care of hundreds of patients around Maryland, working as a clinical director agency. And frankly, I've run across in my practice, okay, people that have accidentally used cannabis inhalation to help quelch the voices they hear with schizophrenia, to help quench the manic episodes of bipolar. Okay. It works, but only full spectrum, whether they inhale it or whatever. And most of what we're coming across in the real world, okay, is different combinations of singular isolated cannabinoids, whatever the company decides to try that month. Okay. So I have nothing except that I know for a fact that full spectrum works for most everything. Okay. But with the hemp debacle we have, a lot of things have gone crazy. Maryland has completely banned hemp. So, what do we do in the meantime with all the, again, dealing with the prohibitionist rhetoric again? Now, in pseudo studies, in my opinion, these are pseudo studies, because if you read to the end, there's no correlation or causation to back up the headline, right? But the headline got enough traction that everybody believes the negative outcome. So that's the frustration I have. It's driving me insane. And another question I have is, why can't we go back to whatever the studies were done on Marinol and put the whole thing to rest and say, you already studied synthetic THC in your, double-blind studies. Get off of it. Cannabis as a plant will never be able to be studied like that. There's too many varietals.
Yeah. I think, just to pull this back, because PTSD is really sort of my niche. It's what I worked with for years, like 20 years. I had it myself now for almost 30 years. And what I know is that inhaled methods of whole plant work best. And even when Dr. Sue Sicily was first trying to get her study going, and she was having such difficulty getting funding and getting her study going, I was telling her it has to be an inhaled study, because what I'm seeing, what patients are telling me, and what I myself know from experience is that the edible forms don't really work. The sublingual forms don't really work. I mean, they work for different things, but if somebody's in crisis,
right,
they need to be able to have that 30-second relief. Something about the breathing and the stopping and the taking a minute. The whole ritual of it is very, very helpful for somebody who's in a PTSD traumatic crisis, right? And I've seen that so many times that it doesn't matter what research will ever tell me. You can't tell me different, because I've seen it with my own eyes. I've experienced it myself. But it's interesting to me how I was looking at the research, and it looks like these studies weren't inhaled. They were edible forms of oral forms of isolates. And I have to say, they're correct. That isn't going to help PTSD patients. So back to what you were saying, Uva, them saying cannabis as a whole, as one thing, is putting cannabis again backwards instead of moving us forward. Like you were saying too, Debbie, the methods of administration. And I would even venture to say that the other nuance is mental health in general. my level of anxiety. Love and I might both suffer from anxiety, but the anxiety I experience could be different than the anxiety she experiences. And she might be able to use a CBD tincture and that works great. And that doesn't even touch mine. So, just the diagnosis of anxiety is such a spectrum itself that, it did say that it helped with sleep for insomnia, though, which is really great for all of these anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Being able to get a good night's sleep, from what I've seen, helps pretty much all mental health patients. So there's that.
Well, one of the things that I find that we don't do in these studies is we don't talk about quality of life. And so we're talking about symptoms and treatment, but we don't ever ask about their quality of life. And what does that look like? I just did an interview with Dr. Gallo out of Africa that has done a study on prostate cancer and cannabis. And that was one of their questions that they asked. And so it was improving sleep, it was improving anxiety, it was giving the ability to focus and be engaged with their family. And so when you just start looking at it from that perspective, you're increasing their quality of life. And isn't that what we should be trying to do with any research that we do, with any treatment that we do? And so I think that that's something that we that are in this industry have to continue to talk about, is the quality of life that is improved with cannabis and cannabinoid therapies.
Debbie, you're absolutely right. I in fact just entered Shiksha's team's study on prostate cancer into the Cannabis platform, and we actually reworked the entire dashboard and synopsis with her study results at front center. And so have a look at it, because I was really impressed with what they published, and I think this is enough to actually warrant a treatment algorithm for prostate cancer, just because there isn't much else that works, for this patient population, and compared to other things, this is a really safe paradigm of a treatment approach. And and they checked out all chemotypes,
Yep.
and so they have specific dosage recommendations, and this is the kind of study that we should have right and left across every condition for which cannabis shows efficacy. And so I'm glad you brought up Dr. Gallo's. Am I saying her name right? Shiksha
Yes,
Gallo?
you are.
Anyway, if you see her, tell her thank you so much for sending me the email of her studies, because they're not in PubMed, so we didn't find them. But they are some of the, this should be in the New York Times or in the Guardian, wherever they publish these studies. And so, anyway, for what it's worth, I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, I think that we have to talk about quality of life in any of these studies, and that's, this is a great study to show how that is demonstrated and how that's accomplished through a study.
I like I said, I love it.
So, yeah, we did a whole hour interview with her and asking her questions around this whole research and how it felt, how it came to be, and she still has trouble getting anybody to even want to put it in their journals. Because
yeah, I mean, that's why I guess it's not in PubMed, but we put it up as soon as I found it. And like I said, we reworked the entire synopsis and clinical considerations and implications around the outcomes of these studies, just to share it with the clinicians or the patients that suffer from prostate cancer, because this is a gold standard currently available. It's really sweet.
Other thing, if you're talking about following the thread, Heather, on social media, but if you follow the thread of this on LinkedIn, it is the medical professionals and the ones that are afraid to enter and talk about using cannabis for mental health. So you would see comments about, oh, this is good to know. Glad I know this now. Thanks for
Exactly.
sharing.
Yeah.
So we have two different sides that are commenting on this. We have the patient and the person that's doing the actual experience. And then we have the providers who are looking at the research to determine how they're going to move forward. And that's what we try to do, is to bring those two together and show how they can work together.
Yeah, people making fear choices so much easier than wonder choices, curiosity choices, wanting to learn choices. So it's so easy to listen to that amygdala response. Oh my God, I'm going to get sued. I'm going to get into trouble, so let's just not even open that door and look at it.
So how do we ethically communicate the risks without creating fear?
By doing it in a way that is transparent and that asks questions in a balanced fashion. We always try to show the harm potential alongside the therapeutic potential. And again, especially when it comes to the endocannabinoid system or the state of each individual's endocannabinoid system, we need to carefully assess that and find the ideal cannabis constituents that are going to work for each individual patient. And that is a process that can't be sort of like a cookie cutter, one size fits all approach, the way we're doing it with diagnosed mental health issues. Like, you get depressions, you get these 5 medications. You have PTSD, you get these psychoses, you get these. And it just doesn't work that way with cannabis. We need to apply complexity and discernment in a balanced fashion. And I think you're already doing it, Heather. I mean, anytime I've been part of what it is that you do, I've seen you live the very thing I just tried to put in words.
Yeah, context is everything when it comes to clinical decision making. It really is. One of the other parts that we were talking about was this reductionist mindset versus this holistic viewpoint. Or my MS patient that said, I put it on my legs, I rub it on my legs at night to go to sleep. And if I get a good night's sleep, then my mood is better during the day and I have to smoke less during the day. Not just focusing on each symptom, but recognizing the whole system and how cannabis can be beneficial as a whole.
Well, two things I want to throw in the mix. One is I agree. And most of the studies that actually looked at the difference between isolates and full spectrum with regards to amounts needed to achieve a desired effect and how much is needed per day or per week, that they found out that full spectrum goes a lot longer as far as therapeutic efficacy is concerned at a lower dose with a better safety profile. So having said that, there is something I think we need to be aware of the dose-dependent psychosis inducing potential of THC. And so, Rick Simpson, the formulation, Rick Simpson cured himself of cancer, telling people to take a gram of THC on a daily basis. I can't even imagine what more than 5 milligrams would do to me, because 5 milligrams is my threshold dose of feeling relaxed and therapeutic. If I take more than 5 milligrams, I have adverse effects. And so I'm giving you a quick story here. I made cannabis oil and I infused cookies. I was hungry. I ate one. I didn't feel it. I can eat some more. I ate some more. About 45 minutes to an hour later, the people in the room were talking to each other. But do you know those old martial art movies where the voices don't match the lip thingies? there's like a 3-second delay between what you hear and what the lips moving. That's what happened to me. And I freaked out and I went into an intense paranoid state. If I hadn't been a paramedic who knows how to talk people down, and I knew how to talk myself down. I checked my pulse. I know I'm having a panic attack. I'm having a severe adverse reaction that was some of the most intense panics I've ever felt. So I understand why people call 911 when they feel that, right? And I had to lie down, play music, calming music, and lower the lights, and it didn't go away for 16 hours. I was literally lying there curled up like a child, terrified. And so I don't know how much I took, but
Too much. That
I
was just too much.
and so anyway, so to go back to Rick Simpson telling people to take a gram, which is like 1,000 milligram on a daily basis in order
Wow.
to deal with their cancer, which on a side note, it actually turns out that only half of people with cancers have some form of remissions. The other one, the cancer gets worse. And there is a scientific explanation behind it, but besides the point, I don't want to go off on a tangent. So communicating the relaxation potential of the appropriate amounts of THC at the right dose for each individual patient is key. And not everybody is going to have a psychotic episode or a schizophrenic positive or negative symptoms expression that would qualify in the DSM-5 as befitting to be diagnosed along those lines. But dose and THC is the primary driver of severe adverse reactions in the mental health community. And so that is not to say that patients can benefit from THC at a dose that's right for them. And it's especially vulnerable for, at least according to the research that's out there, those folks that have a history of mental illness and who have other vulnerabilities that makes them more likely to have a psychotic episode, independent of THC or THC amount. There are a lot of things that can cause a psychotic episode, including one of the reasons they included in the meta studies, moving from a rural area to an urban area had the same risk potential for psychosis as an overdose with too much THC. So there's a lot of things that it's a moving target and it's hard to hit it. The other thing is there's this mindset among growers that bigger is better, more concentrated THC is better. Rather than looking at balanced ratios, looking at higher amounts of CBG, and now we're getting more and more studies showing that chemotype 5, which is primarily CBG, is really well perceived for this particular patient population dealing with mental health issues. And so there is now studies looking at CBG or CBG dominant chemotypes. It's just a natural evolution to sort of like include that. But also, like 30 years ago, the average THC content, what was it like, 6%, 7%? And now
I thought it was like 12, 15 by the time I was doing it as a teenager.
You might know better than I do.
But 20% and above is way plenty. You don't need 30%, 40%, 50%. 80%.
Well, right now the max is around 30. I don't think there's a living plant that produces more THC.
Oh no, but they're making concentrates.
Yeah, concentrate
up
can
to
be
90%.
Up past 90. Yes, absolutely.
And they wonder why people are getting sick. I mean, I find it laughable. Yeah, it might be pesticides, but I'm telling you, To me, it's laughable that they're not looking at concentrates as being, a high causation of this.
And again, that's when we come back to this study. They're not studying whole plant, they're studying
Right.
isolates.
Right. And you're
And
not going to get a
primarily the
cancer.
THC, CBD, and primarily, I think I read in there where it was the FDA approved pharmaceutical, right? So the Epidiolex and the
Right.
Marinol and the
Epidiolex already have liver function tests that are getting elevated because of taking Epidiolex.
Yeah, but they
Found
don't
that in
translate
study.
into symptoms. They just translate it into elevated liver values. And as soon as you discontinue the values go down. But there hasn't been any evidence that short of minor gastrointestinal disturbances, the liver values don't translate into a liver failure of any sort.
But we
Now,
don't know that yet.
we don't know that yet. That is
Over
true.
time.
We don't
It's like
know.
all
We
these
don't
drugs
know
they take off
because
of the market over time.
that's right, because studies over long periods of time have not been done yet.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah,
It's
I just think it's really interesting, that this meta-analysis was looking at just this, the RCTs, and they exclude the complex real world, real patient experience. Data informs, but really it's the patients that define the care, right? It's the patients that matter. And so it's interesting. Even one of the other things I read in here, it was talking about so there were a couple of places where they said that it actually did help, right? That didn't ever make the headlines or the news, but it was talking about sleep. It helped with your autistic traits. It helped with tics from Tourette's. And it helped with, get this, cannabis use disorder, right? Can you imagine that if you give THC and CBD, it can help with your cannabis use disorder?
Actually, to be more specific, it's low THC and CBD independently or in conjunction, not high THC, small amounts of THC and CBD being more prominent in the literature, showing up as a therapeutic agent for cannabis use disorder.
And they said what I read in there was that it reduced the amount of grams that a patient or that a substance user, a cannabis use disorder patient would use. So, right. I mean, like if I'm having cannabis withdrawals from having cannabis use disorder and you're giving me cannabinoids, that makes sense, right? But you don't see that in the headlines as well. So that, again, coming back to how does it circulate? The very first thing that you said, Uva, wow, this study sure made tracks, right? It got a lot of traction and it went really far.
Yeah, I suspect that there's moneyed interest behind it. Even a progressive newspaper like The Guardian, you'd expect a more balanced write-up, but no. I guess advertising and money matters.
Yeah. So we're up against the prohibitionists again. I mean,
the same things we just said about utilizing low dose THC and CBD, helping with mental health issues, also applies to cardiovascular disease. It turns out that higher doses of THC can make it worse, while very low dose, the microdosing with THC and CBD is actually cardioprotective. That's what the science really says.
And it makes sense, right? This plant is balanced and it is biphasic, and it a little can be good and a lot can be bad, and so just keeping that in mind, that a healthy balance is important. I did want to make one other comment though about research in general. And this article was a meta-analysis. So they weren't conducting research. They were looking at the research that has been done and published research. And we all know, I know you know, Uva, that we've been on the side of trying to be on research teams to try and get research done, right? And there is this roadblock that happens when you're trying to conduct research to show benefits. There is no money available. And even worse than that, the IRB will not approve your study if you are looking for benefit. They really only want to hear about the harm. They're very, very focused on the harm. Even if your research article shows benefit, like the researcher you were talking about, Debbie, you get this wonderful research and then you can't get published.
You get buried.
What they're doing a meta-analysis on is the research that was able to get funded, that was able to get published, that was looking predominantly at harm and reduced and downplayed the benefits in general. And that's what we're seeing anyway. So it is a suppression of true information, in my opinion. And it stinks because I'm somebody that loves research and I want to be a seeker of knowledge and truth. But it's unfortunate that the more that I've gotten involved in it, the more I've realized, oh no, this is terrible, right? So coming back to like what you do, Dawn Marie, where we're working with the patients and we're seeing what we're seeing. I remember 20 years ago, I was working with patients and they were using cannabis and I was helping them get off of their pharmaceutical meds, predominantly their pain medications. And I would say, I'm seeing these patients, they are reducing their opioid use, their opioids by half, by 50%, like very clearly across the board, 50% reduction. And then many of those patients would also over time get off completely. Well, it was 10 years later, after I was already seeing that and saying that the research would catch up. And so there's this thing that I kind of wish I had a quarter for every time I've said it, like, oh, the research finally caught up to what we're seeing clinically. So again, I think it's really, although the research is important, what we're seeing clinically and with the patient in front of us is the most important thing.
Absolutely.
But again, they're finding with these studies and meta-analysis and everything else that they are trying to target THC as being the culprit, because THC is the psychoactive molecule, right? The intoxicating molecule. Okay, so in my mind, clinically, we use THC very sparingly, and we've had very good success with that. Not microdosing, mind you, far from microdosing, but not to the level of what you would see in an RSO or any concentrate that's on the market today. So this is why I go back and say to everybody that's pointing to cannabis as being harmful, and especially mentally, I want to see the original studies of THC for Marinol, because that's where the study was done that everybody accepted.
And like Uva said, that was low THC. That's 2.5 milligrams.
But that's what they deemed as being safe to start a patient on, was 2.5. So 2.5 should be the amount of any cannabis medicine that they decide to make as a starting dose. Because they have, I know this because I went on Marinol when I was starting my journey, and I was still working in the field. So I wanted that backup. 2.5, 7 or 2.5, 5, and 10 are the doses of Marinol you can get on the market. It should be the same for anything they make with THC.
No, they actually created a standard for research. Now the standard dose to be researched for THC is 5 milligram in research.
Okay, that's reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I agree, that is reasonable. But here's another interesting, the way I'm looking at it, they talk about psychoactivity and psychoactivity being an adverse effect, euphoria being an adverse effect. And I'm like, that's a desired effect. That's a therapeutic effect. In fact, they don't go as far as calling relaxation an adverse effect, but they really, when they're fighting cannabis, they're really fighting its main purpose, which is to reestablish homeostasis and a deep sense of relaxation, which most people in this crazy world have totally forgotten how to do. In that state of total relaxation, we can reconnect with the innate intelligence of our body and read and interpret and understand, have an intuitive understanding of what our body is trying to tell us through these symptoms, and then address them in a way that's constructive. And so by fighting the main and the primary effect of THC, deep sense of relaxation, we are shooting ourselves in the foot and making this fear-driven world in ourselves and in our society so much worse, rather than embracing a plant within an appropriate safety parameter. In other words, finding the right dose for each individual patient to get to that deep sense of relaxation. And for me, it's 5 milligrams. If I hit that, I'm happy. I am deeply relaxed, and it's a meditative process. If I take more, horrible, right? If I take less, it's not quite right. For me, the sweet spot is 5. I don't know for each of what the sweet spot for each of you is, but independent of that, THC induces a deep sense of relaxation. Why are we fighting this? Why are we fighting a war against relaxation?
Especially for mental health patients.
Especially because they are living in a sympathetic dominant state 24/7. Most everybody else does too, but especially mental health patients.
We're in a different environment now, and I'm grateful for that, but we are still fighting this stigma on the medical side, which I thought we were already past. And so I think it's important that these discussions happen and that we come together as the brilliant minds that we are to discuss these things, partially to help ourselves know that we're not crazy, because I read this stuff and I go, am I the one that's wrong here? What am I missing? How can this be the headline? Am I that far off? And so I'm really grateful that you all come together and share your perspectives. What was that you just put in the chat there, Uwe?
I just shared the article that the official Cannabis responds to that study, in case you're interested in reading it or sharing it.
Thank you for letting us publish it in the newsletter also.
Oh, please, Debbie, anything we can, you need from us, we'll be happy to give you.
Because, this is a conversation that needs to be heard around the world, not just in the U.S. And that's one of the things that is frustrating, because no matter where you live and what you have for mental illness, it's impacting everybody. Exactly. So,
yeah, thank you, Uwe. Tell Jen hi, and thank you for sharing you with us. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We're not here to defend a plant. We're here to support people through that knowledge, through the presence, and through the truth. And it takes one of us knowing what the truth is for ourselves before we can share that with others. So thank you for being here and sharing your truth.